Hello, welcome to Convergent Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I'm very proud to have with me on the podcast Nelson Lichtenstein. Nelson is research professor in the Department of History at University of California, Santa Barbara, where he directs the Center for the Study of Work, Labor, and Democracy. He has a bachelor's from Dartmouth College and a Ph.D. from the University of California, Berkeley. He's held fellowships from National Endowment for Humanities, Rockefeller and Guggenheim Foundations, University of California, and Fulbright Commission and Oregon Center for the Humanities. He's the author of numerous books, including his most recent book, which was co-authored with Judith Stein, A Fabulous Failure, the Clinton Presidency and the Transformation of American Capitalism. And that is what we talk about in this conversation. We start by talking about his collaboration with Judith Stein, who is now passed, and he talks about some of her ideas and how they began working on it and how he continued the book after she passed. We talk about why Clinton focused on economic issues for his presidency, both terms, but definitely the first term. We talk about Al Fromm and the Democratic Leadership Council, the impact of Ross Perot in the 92 presidential election. We talk about some of the important figures in Clinton's economic team, failures of healthcare, economic negotiations with Japan, NAFTA, the 94 crime bill, repealing Glass-Steagall, legacy of the Clinton presidency, and many other topics. I really enjoyed this conversation. I think that there's been some debate, and there's been some work that's been done now on the Clinton presidency, now that we're 30 and 35 years away from it, at least from the first term, and that's usually when people start kind of thinking about historically how presidents worked and the efficacy of their presidency, and Nelson is got a really great voice here. He's, a lot of people have been saying, well, what was really effective here? And was it effective? And he asks a lot of good questions. His book is deeply researched. It's very specific in a lot of areas. It's a great account of this time and of the presidency. And I found it very engrossing. He's a fantastic person, quite brilliant. And I really, really enjoyed speaking with him. As always, you can find this conversation and all other conversations at convergingdialogues@substack.com. I'm also on YouTube, so follow, share, subscribe, contribute if you'd like. I appreciate the contributions. And tell your friends, and sharing is definitely what helps keep the podcast growing, so I want more of that. And now I bring you Nelson Lichtenstein. I am here with Nelson Lichtenstein. Nelson, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. I'm looking forward to talking with you.
Glad to be here.
Yeah, you have written I'll say a fabulous book. You've written a fabulous book, which is called A Fabulous Failure, the Clinton Presidency and the Transformation of American Capitalism. Definitely caught my eye, and I kind of just inhaled this and really, really loved it. I loved all the detail in there. So we'll talk all about that. Before we do, I should make a note of this. This is you and Judith Stein, who is now gone from us. She's passed. But why don't you tell us a little bit before we get into the book about who you are, both professionally, academically, and anything that's relevant at the moment.
Yeah, I taught for many years at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Before that, University of Virginia. I'm an academic, but actually kind of I try to be a little bit of an activist if I can, I was sort of trained as a labor historian, but I actually don't quite like the word labor historian. I mean, because labor, capital, politics, ideas, they're all one thing, and you can't divorce one from the other. So, and many people who think of themselves sort of as labor historians are really just students of capital, students of business. And I wrote a book on Walmart, and then here I'm writing a book on policy. On policy and. Which is crucial to the labor movement, to the welfare state, to all sorts of things that that were taking place in the last 30 and 40 years. So anyway, so I have written one of my, actually recently in the news, the UAW has been gone on strike, and I wrote a biography of Walter Reuther, the famous leader of the UAW. So I've been talking a lot about that, and it's a huge contrast between the status of labor in the 1990s and in the Clinton era and today, and maybe we'll touch on that as well. So that's what I've been doing, and I've enjoyed it, and I've had some wonderful grad students, again, who by the way, who are come to work with me because they see the question of labor, the labor metaphysics, so-called, that the society should work in the interest of working people, but they often study things like finance or international trade or things of that sort. So the moniker labor historian, I think, should be perhaps retired, and we're just historians with a particular point of view.
Yeah, no, that's very helpful. It's a nice context. So with the book, very fascinating, very, very fascinating. So to start, you mentioned your late co-author, as I said, Judith Stein. I guess you talk about I think in the introduction, a preface or whatever, but could you talk about her contribution, what her kind of program was, how she started the book, it came together, and how you finished it without her, actually?
Yeah, well, I've known Judith Stein for many decades, and she was a great historian, very important. She wrote a book on the running America, about the decline of the steel industry, and then she wrote a book on the 1970s. She called it a crucial decade, one in which we moved from factories to finance. That was the phrase she used. So Judith had the idea for this book, and she had a proposal and a book contract. And then she'd just begun it, really, and sort of sketching it out. She hadn't done much. I mean, a little bit of research and maybe a kind of couple rough chapters. And then she died, passed away in the spring of 2017. I wrote an obituary, which for dissent, which kind of explained where she was historiographically and what her perspectives were. And as a result of that, her agent asked me to take over it. And I remember I assembled my graduate students, and we looked over, and we discussed what would happen. But as I indicated in this preface, it's funny. It's funny. Collaborating with anyone is often hard. And then, of course, she passed away. So while the idea of a book about the Clinton administration was hers, and that was an important, both politically and also economically, it was hers, and some ideas she had, I agreed with them anyway, and she was just beginning to sketch them out, like ideas about varieties of capital. That was a issue in the early 90s. So that was, but basically I wrote the book. The book is mine, and but I'm happy to have her on the cover because I respect, venerate, and I think she's a terrific. She was a kind of force. She was both an intellect and a kind of moral force for many, many people. So, but I can't really. Again, I can't really say. I can sort of say what some of her ideas were that I think I know they were, but many things in the book I don't know whether she would have gone along with or not. I think she probably would have. We were on the left in general, but I can't say that for sure, because she did pass away.
Yeah, no, that's very, very nice. Yeah, I think it's nice that you give her, kind of her due and credit. So I guess a way that could be helpful to kind of come into this is a kind of a general kind of preamble here. So typically people write about presidents, 30, 40 years, you wait a generation or two, and there's certain moments. And when I was reading this, I said, I guess it's kind of coming upon that time for, at the very least, first term Clinton. It's been a solid 30 plus years. And I think for a while, people had this idea that, the economy was so good, we ended with a surplus or whatever. And the 90s were just this boom. And so the book is kind of the opposite. It says, yes, there's some highlights here, some positive moments, but there's a lot of things that didn't go right. And I don't know if that's because, we had 9/11 and the wars, and then we had the financial crash, and people have just kind of forgot about it, or, the whole impeachment thing. But it was really nice to see you kind of tackle the mostly the economics of the Clinton administration, showing some of the slip ups here. So I guess the one major question for Clinton when he came into office, and we can talk about some of his early beginnings, but why was his general focus on economics? And why did he choose, kind of the now we know failed universal health care and some of the labor rights stuff? Why was his focus on economics for the in the beginning at the very least?
Well, let me say first that, there is a reason that history exists as a discipline, because one can get insights into events and see the consequences, when you have a certain amount of time and to see how things worked out, and you could go back to whether the French Revolution has worked out. That would also be something to, or the Protestant Reformation. How's that done? Anyway, so the Clinton, so you get a certain insight as time passes. And by the way, the title of the book is really a takeoff on a short book written by Janet Yellen, currently the Secretary of Treasury, and Alan Blinder, an important economist and also in the Clinton administration. They wrote a very short little book called A Fabulous Decade. They wrote it in the year 2000. And yes, they pointed out that unemployment was low, the budget was balanced, the stock market was booming, and et cetera. There were many things, and this was the period when economists on this is sort of the Goldilocks economy, not too hot, not too cool, just right. Well, things happened after that, and which puts a different flavor on it, and I indicate that some of the disasters of certainly 2008 and 9 were, you could lay a good deal of it at Clinton's feet and his people. Now, Bill Clinton comes of age in the 60s and early 70s. So he comes out of a certain kind of new left world. He by the 70s, when he's politically ambitious, and he clearly was. All his friends knew that he wanted to go back to Arkansas and certainly become either a senator or governor of the state, and then beyond that, something beyond that. Anyway. But Arkansas is a poor state. It's always this, the second poorest in the country after Mississippi. And the fundamental problem of at least anyone who's not just self-serving, if you're a governor or a politician in Arkansas, is how do you economic development? And Clinton was, smart enough, liberal enough, connected enough with other people, and I want to talk about that in a second, to know that the traditional Southern way of getting jobs, which was to have low wages, just recruit, buy payroll as it were, and have poor services, bad education, but have some minimum wage jobs. Well, Clinton knew that was not where he wanted to go. He went all around the world as governor. He went to Japan, he went to northern Italy, he went to Germany, looking for models and other ways of enhancing economic development in Arkansas. And he was, as I say, one of the things about it as being a Rhodes Scholar, which he was, but he connected himself with all sorts of people, kind of also came out of the New Left, but were interested in this period of stagflation in the mid 70s. They were, what's wrong with the American economy, and we have to do something about it. People like Robert Reich and Ira Magaziner, and a whole bunch of people. By the way, he would go famously to these Renaissance. What were they called? The New Year's Eve, they would have these Renaissance weekends. You think of, New Year's Eve, a lot of dancing and partying, and I'm sure they drank enough. But what these Renaissance weekends were seminars on workshops on what do we do politically about healthcare or about unemployment, and that's what it was all about. And he was that was his sort of lingua franca. He was a sort of serious is sort of serious. I mean, he had his own problems, but he was kind of serious minded in that respect. And then, of course, the Democrats were losing. This was a period really from Nixon on, when the Democrats were losing, and Jimmy Carter's administration was was kind of a, well, one term he was defeated by Reagan and then Bush. So it was also combined with a political agenda. How do the Democrats get back in and be a governing party? And by the year 1992, there had already been at least 15 years of wage stagnation. Unemployment was higher in that period, and even before. And so there are these manifest economic problems facing the country, and Clinton, that was what he was concerned with. He was not a cultural warrior, in that respect. I'll just say that just one thing. Maybe we'll get to the famous phrase that James Carville, a campaign consultant, but more than that, not more than just manipulating the polls. The famous phrase that he stuck on the wall of the Clinton War Room in Little Rock was called "The economy stupid," meaning keep your eye on that issue. Don't go off on and try to debate with George H.W. Bush various cultural questions, or Pat Buchanan, who was kind of more right-wing Republican at that time. Keep your eye focused on the economy, on reviving it, on getting better wages for working class people. That was what, keep it on that. Don't talk about the budget, balancing it or not, which Clinton didn't talk very much about that in his 1992 campaign. So that was that's where he came from in part.
Yeah. That resonates. And I guess it's interesting because, as you're talking about in the 70s and 80s, the economic landscape, it was, recession, inflation, deindustrialization, all of these things. He had this kind of tense relationship with the labor movement when he was governor of Arkansas. But I guess, could you talk about when he was running and he started to become aligned with Al Fromm and the Democratic Leadership Council, and he was disengaging from unions and embracing markets more than government. And then this is where we eventually get that third way. But as he's building that 92 campaign, knowing the landscape economically, knowing kind of who he's aligning with, I guess, why did he choose to focus on the economy in the way that he did? Obviously, the economy was central, but why specifically did he choose the specific way?
Okay, let me make 2 points here. There's no doubt, and let me say, if you think of the American labor movement in its the entire course of the 20th century and recently, the worst period for the labor movement in terms of attractiveness, as a kind of liberal, progressive lodestar, is this period of the 70s, 80s, and 90s. So this is the worst period for a variety of reasons. That the labor movement was the last Cold Warriors. They were not good on race and gender questions in this period, and then it was also a period of anti-labor. Kind of political and economic movements on the part of corporations, et cetera. So Clinton, and this is one of the fatal flaws, I think, of Clinton in this, was in Arkansas and in the White House, is he wanted to be a liberal, economically liberal, really without labor, without dealing with labor. So he crossed in Arkansas when he did propose a tax increase to pay for better schools, and which was a substantial thing. He did that by and Hillary did too, by being demagogically critical of the teachers' unions. Which was it was sort of he thought that was politically clever, and somehow that would gain him some credit. I'm not sure it did, but they did that. So this is one of the elements of liberalism in this period. Now, when it comes to the campaign for the White House, and here is where I am sort of revisionist. I'm a little taking issue with the general view of some journalists and other historians is about the Democratic Leadership Council. The Democratic Leadership Council is formed in the mid-early 80s, really among Southern Democrats, or seeking to preserve their political viability by moving to the right. I mean, people could see that the South was shifting toward the Republicans, and the DLC was going to be, okay, how can we preserve Southern really white Democrats in office? And that was what it was. Its point was. And it was the DLC was a collection of existing office holders, like Nunn from Georgia or Robb in Virginia, et cetera, and a few Northerners, but not as many. So for example, one of the things that DLC did was to create the Southern primary. It's still with us, a big primary in March with lots of Southern states. Well, the whole point of that was so that a Southern figure could, become president, with lots of what they thought was, white Democratic votes. The Al Fromm was one of the key leaders of it. And frankly, I find him a braggart. I find that he is always exaggerating the influence of the DLC. And so, for example, yes, Clinton did become a member of the leader of the chair or the chair of the DLC. I think in 1990 and 91. Well, Al Fromm goes down to Arkansas and tells Bill, "Look, I want you to, become leader of the DLC. I'll make you president, and I'll be famous," or something like that. Well, Bill Clinton takes a year to decide. I mean, it wasn't like this was his thing. He took a year to decide. So in my view, he used the DLC as much as they used him. And one thing I found in my research is, and here we get to this economy, a stupid question. The DLC thought that the Democratic Party should play the culture card. It should be against welfare. It should be in favor of, the Second Amendment, guns. It should be, more hostile to gay marriage. It thought that the way you appeal to white Southerners was on that basis. And they called what had been the traditional Democratic Party view, strengthen the working class, strengthen unions, use the welfare state if needed. They called that liberal fundamentalism, which they were against. Carvel's statement on the wall was an anti-DLC perspective. And Clinton and his people in the first 2 years, certainly, of the administration, ignored the DLC. And there are memos from Al Fromm to Bill Clinton saying, "Hey, what are you doing? Why aren't you dealing with us?" He's very upset. And one of the DLP kind of academic intellectuals, William Gaston, he says, who was in the Clinton administration, he said, "Well, we were sort of like a raisin in a bowl of white rice or something. There's just a few of us, and we had no influence." And that's the first 2 years. So I do think there's an exaggeration of the importance of the DLC. Now later on, Clinton did move to the right, and the DLC would take a lot of credit for that. But I would say just one more thing. In the early, we'll get to this I'm sure in a bit. A number of the things which are considered conservative in the early part of the Clinton administration, for example, the balancing the budget, the DLC had nothing to do with it. They were not players. They were focused on these cultural warfare issues. I mean, Bill Gaston, for example, loved the idea of public service, for youth. I mean, kind of might be a good idea, but that or ideas of let's. Welfare reform was their big thing. And they saw that not just because of what's going to do for the people on welfare, but they saw it as a cultural marker. That does pass, but not till 1996. It didn't. It was not the first thing that Clinton pushed for when he became president. We can talk about that. So.
So when we get to the 92 campaign, we can just have this as a small footnote, but, I feel like it's somewhat relevant here is Ross Perot. Perot, you don't have to go long on this, but Perot is such a fascinating person. And then what he did in the 92 campaign, he pulled out and then he re-entered in October, and there was some weird thing there. And my memory's fuzzy on this, but,
right.
I guess kind of talking about these you had three dueling legitimately ideas about economy. I mean, you had Bush, HW, and then you had Clinton and you had Perot. And just talk about, again, this in the end, Clinton wins, but that wasn't always a sure thing. And so I guess kind of to try to find this pulse of where people were trying to figure out economically. Maybe just talk about the impact, I guess, a bit of Perot.
Perot is important and interesting, and has some consequences. So Ross Perot, a Texas billionaire, but not identified, by the way. He didn't identify as a Southerner. That was not his calling card. And he didn't play the race card or anything of that sort. Anyway, but he did. What he did was, he helped advance the idea that the American economy has real problems, and we need some really important structural changes. That was one of the things he did. He was, of course, hostile to the free trade pacts that both Bush and Clinton himself would champion. And so his famous phrase was, if we pass NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement, there'll be a giant sucking sound, pulling American industry into Mexico. So he's famous for that. He also, but his economic solutions were, okay, we must balance the budget. That's crucial. Get rid of the deficit. So that had a kind of impact on and some of Clinton people said, well, we have to accommodate, or at least we have to try to attract some of the Perot voters and some of the Perot sentiment. Interestingly, by the way, Perot's biggest support was not in the Deep South, not in Virginia, for example, where I was living at the time, but in places like Maine and Washington State and the Upper Midwest. He wasn't playing this old-fashioned Southern card. Anyway, he entered the race in the spring of 1992. Did very well. At one point, Clinton was in third position behind Perot and Bush. Then, for some peculiar reasons, right, he pulls out. I don't know. He had a wedding of his daughter. I don't know. It's still confusing why. Idiosyncratic.
Yeah.
He pulls out. But then I think in September, he comes back in and he ends up winning 19% of the vote, which was a lot of the vote. And I'll just give you my bottom line on Perot and Clinton. I mean, Clinton makes some mistakes. Really fundamental blunders, political. And one of them was not trying to consolidate the Perot vote with the Democrats. And that would have meant not doing NAFTA, at least, because that was one of the big things that Perot was pushing. So in rejecting that, it left these Perot voters sort of up for grabs. And, I think over the next decade, many of them did kind of filter back into the Republican orbit. The Democrats, they never really fundamentally captured them. Now, would Clinton have been defeated had Perot not been in the race? Here, political scientists disagree on this, and unless they basically say that the Perot vote, they took equally from the Democrats and Republicans. In the end, it certainly meant Clinton got 43% of the vote. Perot got 19%, and George H.W. Bush got 37%, which is pretty bad. So that's what that was. So it did mean that Clinton coming into office, virtually every congressman and senator that he had to work with had a higher proportion of the vote than he did, which did not make him that strong a figure when it came to dealing with Congress, and he often wasn't.
Yeah. It's a fascinating presidential campaign for sure. So he wins, And he puts his team together, his cabinet, his economic team, and you talk about this. He selects Tyson and Summers and Reich, and and I guess what was the message he was trying to send by selecting these folks, and then dovetail us into why healthcare was one of the big things and why it was such a failure.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the appointments of any president, they're always a coalition. With Clinton, there were clearly some of these people who I call them these sort of industrial policy liberals, many of whom he'd known, some were new to him. And they did get positions. And when I mentioned we used the phrase industrial policy, which was a theme of economic rejuvenation in that moment, and it is again today, by the way, in 2023. What we mean is sort of a governmental guidance of investment, as well as, in some cases, managing trade with countries who are thought to be, unfairly, dumping goods in the U.S. and this mainly Japan. That will be the case anyway. Clinton appoints to some key positions. Some interesting people who certainly the DLC was hostile to, and if the DLC were running the show, they never would have got the first base. So among them were, of course, Robert Reich, who's now way to the left on many questions, and then less so, but nevertheless an advocate of a certain kind of industrial policy and a writer. He'd been writing for a decade very important books that influential. Ira Magaziner, again, another one of the Oxford people that Clinton knew, a kind of a very much of an advocate of health, of industrial policy, and also health reform. He's made sort of in charge of the health reform initiative. And then Laura Tyson, who is an interesting, the first woman ever chosen head of the Council of Economic Advisors, but that wasn't her main calling card. She had been part of a group at Berkeley for a decade who'd been trying to figure out, how America could have a sort of new managed investment strategy to revive American industry. And she was very much in favor of a revival of industry and heavy industry, especially. And then also how to manage trade with Japan. She wrote a book about competing with, who's bashing whom. And Japan in the early 90s was the great trading rival of the U.S. And people were, looked to Japan with a certain amount of fear because it seemed to be more successful than the U.S. So Laura Tyson is one of three candidates for head of the CEA Council. The other is Larry Summers, who is a much more orthodox figure, and the other is Paul Krugman, who would become kind of a liberal. He's a liberal today, but in those days he was very much a free trader, and against really industrial policy. So Clinton chooses Laura Tyson, and that says something because he agreed with her ideas. She was saying, no, I'm not in favor of just new trade pacts that have no guidelines on labor or investment. So she and she's head of the CEA. Now it turns out that the Council of Economic Advisors would not be quite the powerful institution that it had been in earlier decades. And one thing that I have to now say that Clinton also appoints a number of much more orthodox people, of whom the most important is Robert Rubin from Goldman Sachs as first head of the National Economic Council, a kind of new institution that will coordinate economic council throughout the government, economic policy throughout the government, and then later on becomes Secretary of Treasury. So there were also, I go through the Leon Panetta and a number of others who were more orthodox in the usual sense. And these there will be kind of battles within the administration, and I try to trace them out over all sorts of questions. In this early period, the voice of the sort of the Clinton left or the industrial policy left, it's definitely there, and many commentators and observers thought, yes, this is a different kind of administration than went before on economic policy.
Yeah. It's interesting the cast of characters he gets involved and they. I mean, people will know these names even still today, and it's interesting to kind of see their own evolution and
Yeah,
various
right,
administrations they've served in afterwards and what they do now. So healthcare, he tackles this. I mean, we all remember this in the beginning. It was really a failed effort. We can talk about some of the stuff Obama learned in a minute, but I
yeah,
guess the question here is you talk. This is a little bit in the weeds, so I'm curious for how much you want to go into this, but you talked about the Jackson Hole Group and how
yeah,
there was a lot of competition and there was a mix of federal government and HIPCs.
yeah.
So talk about this and then Magaziner and Clinton duo.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let me just. The first thing is to say that the Clinton and everyone, as people saw healthcare reform as industrial policy,
Mm,
because the healthcare burden, especially on older industries like auto and steel, et cetera, was great. And meant that other countries which had more rational and national systems of health provision were basically it was a cost advantage to the competitors,
mm,
foreign competitors of the U.S. So they saw and Clinton was able to get magazine, or they were to get lots of business people, the Chamber of Commerce, the National Association of Manufacturers, et
mm-hmm.
cetera, to yes, we need healthcare reform because this is a burden on us. As the people at Ford Motor Company said, we pay more money for healthcare than for steel, and
Yeah.
that would not be the case, say, in Germany or in Japan or in Canada. Okay,
Mm,
now Clinton, is a person of his time. He was afraid of single payer. The Republicans had demonized that, and
mm,
he said, "Well, look, we're going to have what the kind of health care we're going to have." And the idea of it did emerge from this group called the Jackson Hole Group. What they were a number of big insurance companies that met at I think it's Paul Edelman. I think it's Paul Edelman. I think I've got his name right. He was a healthcare expert going back several decades. Met at his big, country place in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, and they were meeting for a couple of 3 years, in this late '80s, early '90s, and they came up with the idea of what they called managed competition, which meant that you would have large groups of employers who were really forced to purchase health insurance because there'd be a mandate on employers that if you have more than 50 workers, yes, you must, give them health insurance. So the employers would come together and would purchase in block, insurance from then big insurance companies that were getting bigger, by the way, in this period, and some of them were becoming health maintenance organizations as well, like Kaiser. So yes, you'd use the market. The market would be used to drive down prices of insurance, but there'd be great efficiencies because everyone would have to buy insurance.
mm,
And it would be so it was a managed market, as it were. That was the idea, and the Jackson Hole Group was in favor of that. Now these were again very large insurance companies; they were at the center of it. There were also some big companies as well. Now let me just have my big insurance companies thought that if they liked the idea of national health insurance because it meant millions and millions of new clients, right? They
mm,
liked that idea.
mm, mm-hmm.
They were worried about price controls directly, but if it was just the market and you'd have a slight decline in the price, they could make a lot of money.
Mm,
And so they, were on board with the Clinton plan to begin with.
mm.
The group of insurance companies that hated the Clinton plan were the smaller ones. And
Sure.
their business model had nothing to do with getting lots of clients. Rather, their business model was to only insure the young and the healthy, to cherry pick, as it were. And so they hated the idea that they would have that there'll be kind of universal coverage, because that would mean that they would have to insure some of the old and the sick, and they didn't like that. And the famous Harry and Louise TV commercials. Now, I don't know if you'd have to be at least in your 50s to remember these, but they were very, very successful anti health insurance, anti-Clinton plan health insurance commercials, in which a Harry and Louise, husband and wife, were sitting around the table, denouncing basically saying, "Oh, this plan is too big and too cumbersome, and too many government bureaucrats, et cetera, et cetera." And they were very successful. But the point is, they were paid for and made by the smaller insurance companies that didn't like one of the features of the Clinton plan, which was a universal coverage that the big insurance companies were happy to have, because that meant more clients. Now, I think what torpedoed the Clinton plan actually was this. It was two things. One, the Clintons and Ira Magaziner, despite we think of them as sort of new wave Democrats, et cetera, actually were thinking about big old-line industry and the problems they had. Companies like Ford or Chrysler or U.S. Steel or, big companies like that. And they would have benefited enormously. There's no doubt about it from the plan. But in American capitalism was changing. And the Walmarts and the Pizza Huts and the telecommunication companies that were shedding unions and moving to a kind of lower wage, sort of a low benefit model. These companies had more and more power. And so you had actually within the Chamber of Commerce and within the National Association of Manufacturers and actually within the Business Roundtable, these groups that the Clinton was trying to work with and seemingly successfully, there were internal revolts by the franchisees, the McDonald's and the Hallmark cards and the service sector and the Tyson's Foods and all of those companies that were booming in this period, but would have low wages, low benefits, and basically wanted to foist any health and didn't want to give their employees health insurance or foist the cost onto the like the partner who might work for an auto company. And that is what ultimately doomed the Clinton plan. They were not prepared for that kind of internal revolt. And I would just make the point that this was something that caught other people by surprise. Like the editors of Fortune magazine, which have been putting out for 50 years, the Fortune 500, right? A big, industrial companies. Well, in the year 1995, they finally decided that maybe they would admit the retailers onto the Fortune 500 list. So bingo, Walmart appears as number 4. And by 2000, Walmart's number 1. What that meant was that here's a giant company with low wages, low benefits, and militantly hostile to an employer mandate that would require that company to cover all its workers with health insurance. So that was one thing that got the Clintons by surprise. And the second thing was that it became clear to Magaziner and to Hillary Clinton and to Bill even that managed competition was just a theory and not a reality. That the idea that you're going to let the market, even if you manage it, reduce the price, just wasn't going to work, or it wouldn't necessarily work. And the Congressional Budget Office came up with the head of it, Reichauer, came up with a phrase. He said, "Look, managed competition is a pig in a poke. We don't know if it's going to work. What we do need is price controls. We need old-fashioned World War II price controls. Then you can, and he used it. We need the exercise of sovereign power That was the phrase they used. And the Clintons accepted that. Well, once that was the case, then the big insurance companies said, to hell, we don't want this. To hell with that. We don't want those kind of price controls. And so they bailed on it. So those were the things that I mean, then of course, in addition, the Republican Party was moving to the right. But actually one of the things that, again, is a little bit revisionist about my book is I'm not focusing quite so much on partisan politics per se. I'm looking for these underlying economic structures that and how they're shifting. And I think the shift of the Republican Party to the right and becoming militantly hostile to health insurance, I think, reflects the rise of the Walmarts and the Pizza Huts and the low wage companies. Within the Republican Party. I mean, the National Restaurant Association, for example, which is basically a group of the McDonald's of the world and et cetera, and the hamburger chains. I mean, they become very influential in the Republican Party with money and et cetera, all sorts of things.
I guess the question here is that if they were trying to use a lot of for healthcare, private sector and corporations, was there any federal government involvement that they wanted? Did they? I mean, it wasn't that it wasn't there, right?
Yes, the federal government would establish these what were called health purchasing alliances. In other words, they would be kind of regional entities of the government in which employers, small and medium, and even some big ones would become part of, and then they would collectively purchase the health insurance. And then, of course, there'd be guidelines in terms of the quality and things of that sort, and universality. So, yeah, the government plays a role. It was just that the Congressional Budget Office thought you need to play a greater role. If you want to know what the real costs of a program are, you can't ultimately let the market determine. You have to actually have a budget for this, and so the government is very much involved. Now Clinton was trying. I mean, this was an era when Ronald Reagan had inaugurated a mistrust of government, and so Clinton rhetorically was saying, "Oh, the government's going to keep out of this," but in fact, it was right in there. And when it came to with Obama, what I think Obama learned was we're going to cut hard and fast deals with all of the key players, insurance, business, et cetera. We're going to cut those deals and make them stick so that they don't abandon ship, halfway through the program. And in addition to that, we're going to eliminate the employer mandate, which again, the Walmarts of the world really hated, and we'll just raise taxes. It was actually easier to raise taxes on wealthy individuals than to raise taxes or have a mandate on business. And so one of the things no one knows about the Obama plan is it has an extremely progressive and fairly aggressive tax increase in there. And that's what pays for a lot of the subsidies that have gone into, both making Medicaid very large and also subsidizing people purchasing health insurance. I have a little section in my book about what Obama learned, and in the debates with Hillary in 2008, they're going around the country debating. Well, Hillary really knew health insurance, and Obama was actually to the right of Hillary in those debates, saying, "Oh, we don't want an individual mandate. We don't want the government to be involved, quite so involved." And Hillary had learned her lesson, and she knew what she's talking about. And when he finally won the nomination, and they were planning their health insurance for the program for the administration, he said, "Well, I guess Hillary was kind of right. Hillary was right, and the Obama plan does. It's really it looks more like the Clinton plan, but reformed version of the Clinton plan is what it really was. I mean Hillary. So now, I mean, Hillary is demonized, of course, in this period. Kind of like a Shakespearean, like Lady Macbeth, kind of a thing. The woman having too much power, and that's part of American culture. She did plunge. She knew health insurance. She was she went to Capitol Hill, and at first she was extraordinarily popular. knowledge, and was given a certain due by Republicans as well as Democrats. But I think, but the crucial thing was, I think, when these internal revolts take place within the various business associations, and when they abandon ship, that opens the door to the Republican right to just denounce the plan, in every which way.
Yeah. I feel, Hillary was kind of, wrongfully, misaligned for a lot of things. And, it is unfortunate, some of the views people had. I was going to ask, are you talking about in the book, it just as a kind of, again, an epilogue on it, what lessons did Obama learn? And I guess you mentioned some of them there. I guess the one thing on that we have with the, ACA, which people have, tried to repeal a million times and stuff, was, it really was, it almost didn't go through. It really was Pelosi resurrecting it from the dead. End of 2009 and early 2010, and then they finally got it through in March. And so, this was almost didn't even happen. I guess, what was it? I guess he learned some lessons from healthcare in the 90s, but even then it almost didn't get across the finish line. What was kind of tricky there, I guess?
Yeah, well, right. Of course, the Democrats didn't quite have the control of the Senate that they thought they had. By the way, so one of the things that does happen sort of in terms of politics during the 90s is the idea of the 60-vote filibuster threshold, which makes so difficult everything. That comes to the fore and becomes a kind of regularized and accepted in the 90s. It had not been before. That was really a product of Congress. Really, Clinton had little to do with that, and it had to do with the Democrats in Congress sort of accepting the legitimacy of the Republican filibuster when they sought to do that. But Pelosi, kind of finessed the situation by basically the House took the Republican. The House took what the Democrats had passed in the Senate and just they were going to change it in a conference committee, but they couldn't do that because now there are only 59 Democrats in the Senate. So he just took it and ran with it, and it was passed. Let me make one bigger big point that covers from a Biden to Clinton and whatnot. When a political party knows what it wants and has been sort of it's self-educated itself about that, and they've had internal debates, and you don't need to compromise. You don't need to find votes from the Republicans, or another party to get the bill passed. You can pass it with like 50, plus one vote. Clinton the health plan he had there was a little bit vague and it was shifting, and the Magaziner kind of wanted to compromise. So they were always looking for Republican, some Republican moderates or Democratic Southern Democrats. They were always kind of looking for coalitions. They hadn't quite worked it out. By the time Obama comes along, there'd been 15 years of Democratic debate on this. They knew what they wanted, and they passed it, with a slim margin, but they passed it. And I think that's a lesson for a party. You shouldn't fear passing something with a slim margin if you know what you want.
Yeah. I remember it was a lot of the Cornhusker kickback and a lot of the Blue Dog Democrats and all that stuff. Yeah.
Right. But ultimately, they knew what they wanted, they passed it. And then of course, it took a while, but it becomes part of the furniture. It becomes part of the furniture of American social economic life. And so today, unlike the first, say, almost 8 years after it's passed, the Republicans are not attacking Obamacare. They just whatever that isn't their thing. Because it's there. It exists.
Yeah. So quickly, talk about Japan a little bit. You talk about Japan was in the late 80s, early 90s, right before the recession and stuff. I think it was from 45 right after the war until 92 or whatever, was a big competitor. They did so well economically. Do you kind of see these kind of neoliberal policies coming out and how Clinton worked with Japan? Just chat about that story a little bit.
Well, right. Well, the title of my chapter on trade with Japan is a detour on the road to neoliberalism, and I'll get to that. So Japan, by the 1980s, is the second largest economy in the world, and had grown very rapidly. It's also a different economy. There are many, many studies of Japan and then novels about it. Obviously, a kind of Orientalist, kind of view of Japan, but a sort of sense of this is a different variety of capitalism. And Clinton was very much aware of that. Oh, they've organized their system differently from us. The banks had closer relationships to manufacturing. The Ministry of Finance was guiding investment, things of that sort. And many, many Americans and the policymakers in the Clinton administration were well aware of that. There's also a sense that this was a threat. So in the 1992 campaign, one of Clinton's opponents, Paul Tsongas of Massachusetts, not a particular liberal, but he said, he had a statement on the cover of Time magazine, the Cold War is over. Germany and Japan won. Meaning these were two countries on the upswing, competing economically in terms of trade, and also having organized their social economy in a different way than Thatcher and Reagan would have. And so many liberals looked to Japan, and certainly to Germany, okay, let's see how they're doing it. Someone like Laura Tyson, for example, did that, or Jeffrey Garten, who would become a key trade representative dealing with Japan. So, but when it came to Japan, the Bush administration, the Reagan and Bush, or certainly Bush, thought, well, okay, we just need to open up their economy and on free market principles, and then we can sell stuff to Japan, like agricultural products, which had the U.S. could produce very cheaply, but Japan had tariffs and whatnot. But it turned out that there was almost no way, because of the structure of Japanese interconnected industries and banks and the kind of trade restrictions that were just embedded in practically in Japanese politics and culture, there was virtually no way to actually open up that economy. They would sell things to us, but it was very hard to sell cars or car parts or rice or beef or whatever to Japan. And so Clinton came to the conclusion, advised by many people around him, that look, we just have to tell the Japanese government, you're going to buy 20% of all the computer chips that Japan needs from the United States, or we want a quota. A quota of automobiles. We want you to go from selling 1% of your market to 10% of American automobile. This free trade was just not going to work. And they pushed that for 2 years with Japan. It was clearly not neoliberal policy. It was a managed trade policy, and even people like Larry Summers went along with it, at least for a while. Now, what happened to that was that two things. One was that Japan's economy, which had seemed like this complete, steamroller and utterly success, it went into a real long recession, beginning in the really 94 and 90, even before 93, but became kind of apparent 94, 95. So the threat that Japan seemed as a kind of this new model of capitalism, it was lessened because of the long recession that Japan had. Real estate prices were just completely out of sight, and they collapsed, and all sorts of things like that. But the second thing was that Robert Rubin and Larry Summers and people at the Treasury, they sort of liked the idea that Japan had this very large trade surplus with the U.S., because then Japan would have a tremendous amount of yen, and they could buy American bonds. And in buying really trillions of, $1 trillion of American bonds, that would keep American interest rates low. And from Robert Rubin's point of view, the way to expand the American economy was let's have really low interest rates that will make investment easy. And one way to do that is don't worry about Japan. Don't worry about if Japan's export drive puts Chrysler out of business or destroys Midwestern industry. The net effect of having a kind of investment boom on the coast, for example, or in real estate, is much more important. So the Treasury Department was happy to see the yen a decline in value versus the dollar, which meant Japanese imports to the U.S. would be cheaper, which meant Japan would have more money to invest in U.S. bonds. And that's what happened in 1995 and later. Now, what got hurt was Midwestern manufacturing. That took it on the chin, but that was Rubin's perspective.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a very curious tale, and it's interesting how relations between the U.S. and Japan have evolved since this time as well. Yeah. It's very, very fascinating. I do want to talk about NAFTA. So NAFTA is fascinating to me. My ignorant view is NAFTA really worked for some parts of the U.S. for a while. I don't know what it did for the agricultural kind of landscape in the U.S. and for Mexico, but it really did hurt a lot of maybe parts of Mexico and Central American countries, which, in terms of the U.S., we take care of ourselves, but it really was an interesting kind of, I know it was, a lot of people liked it and then they didn't like it. And so why don't you tell us, if I remember correctly, NAFTA has its origins during the Reagan administration, but really it's Clinton's baby and basically keeps getting ratified throughout all the way up to Obama, if I'm not mistaken.
Well,
just tell us about NAFTA.
It had been, right. Well, NAFTA emerges when the Mexican economy had high tariffs and a kind of what was called an import substitution economy. That is, they would make stuff behind a tariff law, whether it was cars or all sorts of products. And the Mexican economy grew very rapidly in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, et cetera, 80s. Then the rise in the price of oil and Mexico got into debt meant that the Mexican government itself, in order to fund the debt, would have to create export earnings, and using the cheap Mexican labor, and often having some American factories producing stuff, to fund the debt. And so the Mexican government was in favor of a freer trade agreement with the U.S. The Bush administration liked it, and they'd really negotiated it. And then Clinton, when he came in, had to decide, was he going to continue to have NAFTA or to try to modify it. They did, in a kind of somewhat tepid way, try to create so-called labor and environmental side agreements. But this was very tepid, and they weren't very good. And the Mexican government was very hostile, especially to the labor. Anything that pushed for the creation of independent unions in Mexico, the Mexican government really hated, because the part of the basis of the Party of Revolutionary Institutions support was the control of labor in the provinces and the countryside. Anyway, so then Clinton, and Clinton, they have to decide, is the Clinton administration going to push NAFTA? They knew there was a good deal of Democratic Party opposition to it. Are they going to push it? And I think it was a blunder to do so. A blunder in the sense that it could have gone the other way. They didn't have to. It had been a Bush administration initiative to begin with. I think one reason Clinton did it is he wanted some semblance of bipartisanship, and he knew he could get some Republican votes for NAFTA. So they push it in the fall of '93. And it's a big battle inside the Democratic Party. Labor's against it. Northern and Midwestern Democrats are against it. it passes with Republican votes and really a minority of Democratic votes. I mean, Bill Clinton was a terrible leader of the Democratic Party. It passes. Now, NAFTA, the Mexican economy is kind of small. It's about the size of Southern California. NAFTA would actually, Ross Perot was not right about a giant sucking sound with NAFTA. If that was applied to China, yes, but not with NAFTA. However, NAFTA was toxic and politically disastrous. A, it's on America's footstep. Footstep. B, it did generate a huge migration, legal and illegal, into the U.S. And this is because one of the elements of NAFTA was that American agriculture, which was very efficient, would be able to sell over time corn and beans and all that, and the basic staples of the Mexican economy, and the staples by which 10 or 20 million Mexican small farmers depended. And these things would now undercut them. So you had this vast migration of Mexican peasants from the countryside to the cities of Mexico and then to the border. And so its effect was to generate this enormous pressure for migration, both to Mexican cities and then to the U.S. Well, that of course has huge political consequences. So NAFTA is a toxic, politically toxic. More so even than economically, but it's both. But politically as much as economically it was. And the political consequence of NAFTA. You talk about factories, jobs lost. The jobs were lost to Mexico and Central America. They weren't exactly like the high wage, skilled jobs in Detroit. Some factories went. They were like the branch plants. Apparel factories or auto parts factories, or the people who made brooms and toys often in southern and rural parts of the American South, where these small low wage factories have been established. They were the ones that go to Mexico. And so this kind of throughout Arkansas, for example, there's a whole depopulation of these small manufacturing towns in the rural areas. And one consequence of that is some historians have looked at this, that there was in 1994 elections, there was a wipeout of white Southern Democratic congressmen. They are wiped out. That's the year when the Republicans become the majority party from the South in Congress. And NAFTA was probably the major cause of that because of its toxicity.
So tell me this. You mentioned it there. I'm curious about this. You can just talk specifics if you want. Why was this polarizing for Democrats? Why were some Democrats for NAFTA and other Democrats were not for NAFTA? What was the big, debate there within the Democratic Party?
Yeah. Well, there was a whole bevy of, free trade. Trade had been liberals had supported free trade going back to the 40s and 50s. That had been a liberal thing. Free trade seemed to be associated with an open world, hostile to whether it's a communist in Eastern Europe or the fascist in Germany before that, or the Japanese co-prosperity sphere. Free trade was to open up those kind of blocks. So like the ILGWU, which was the garment union, composed lots of Jews and Italians and whatnot. They were, and even though garments were one of the first industries that could move abroad and could threaten, compete with American, manufacturers. The ILGWU was very much in favor of free trade because they saw it as a pro-democratic and anti-fascist, anti-authoritarian thing. So that was the labor movement. Well, that would of course change in the 70s and 80s, but there was that element of it, and every economist worth their salt was telling the American public, free trade is a net benefit. And it is in this sense that, yes, the from a consumer point of view, products are cheaper. That's right, they are. When you're buying your Japanese or Chinese or what, I'm wearing my sneakers, my tennis sneakers right now, and they're all made in South China, and they're cheaper. However, the impact of trade of that sort is sort of targeted on specific industries in the U.S. So the shoe manufacturing, in Lynn, Massachusetts, is wiped out, or say auto parts in California are wiped out because they can. And so trade has that. Yes, on an aggregate sense, trade is beneficial to consumers, but it has tremendous impact on specific industries, specific regions. And so, if you were in California, for example. Democratic liberals tended to vote for free trade, or New York State. But if you were in Michigan or Ohio, they'd be against it. So, but it did divide. It more than divided the Democratic Party. By the end of the Clinton administration, a majority of Democrats are voting against these trade initiatives of the Clinton administration. A majority.
So I guess what was the kind of epilogue, I guess, for what the Trump administration had done? They kind of rebranded it, called it something different. People said it was, probably a little bit too much more of than what it was. It really was kind of like NAFTA. What is the current iteration of our trade agreement?
What's it called? It's called the I forgot the exact name, but they did renegotiate it. Even some liberals say that Trump did appoint, when it came to trade, some people who were, they were, tougher. They were better. Mm-hmm. They wanted some real shifts in the nature of these free trade pacts. And the new one with Canada and Mexico does do what NAFTA didn't do. For example, on the labor side, it's much tougher in a number of mechanisms. Permitting Mexican workers to form their own real independent unions. And that has taken place at a big General Motors plant in Mexico. And they have a real union there. And so that means wages and working conditions can get much better, which means you don't have this enormous wage cliff between the U.S. and Mexico. Reduces the incentive to put plants in Mexico, and then when workers are earning more money in Mexico, it means they can buy stuff themselves. So that is, it is definitely a better plan. I mean, of course, it took 25 years of experience, and seeing that any labor side agreements in the original NAFTA were just ineffective and weren't working. So there's some teeth into that. I would say the other thing about NAFTA, by the way, and many of these other trade pacts is. Again, the new industries that are coming on, like Silicon Valley, for example, while the Mexican government was extraordinarily hostile to allowing any international mechanism to say anything about workers' rights, when it came to the penetration of the Mexican court system, judicial system, and so that intellectual property would be protected in Mexico, stuff, say, produced by Microsoft or something, or Apple. Well, there, yeah. And if you look at the 1,000-page NAFTA agreement, as it was originally set up, and the current one as well, huge proportions of it are how, holders of intellectual property, pharmaceutical companies, Silicon Valley, also in Hollywood, will protect that property, in the court system of whether it's Mexico and then more recently in China. I mean, that's where that's where the economic power in the U.S. They're the ones who can really export. We aren't going to export any cars to China, or Mexico, but we are going to export, software and pharmaceuticals and things of that sort.
It's interesting how it's always this push-pull, right? We want to make things here in the U.S. and be able to sell at other places, but we also want to be hospitable to other partners and have good partnerships. It's always a kind of push-pull, but it's interesting the reforms we made. So two final kind of topics here. I guess they're a little bit different, and so one of them is this crime bill. And it became highly controversial a couple of years ago again in the news. I know Bill came out and said he regrets it or something like that. But let me just ask this, I guess. at the time. At the time, things were really tough. There was a lot of violence at the time in the early 90s, and there was a lot of gangs, especially over there in California on the West Coast, and there was a lot of issues, right? There was a need, and even the Congressional Black Caucus voted for a lot of this. Some progressives there. It received enough votes to pass. But now people are doing this kind of revisionist history. You know, we're looking at 2023 eyes and being like, oh, maybe this was tough on certain groups of people, et cetera, et cetera. You know, which is fair in some ways, but at the same time, at the time, it was different. Things were a lot different.
Yeah.
How do we, I guess, well, two questions. One, what was the Clinton administration's idea with this crime bill in the early 90s? And then how have we kind of, reassessed it now 30 years later?
Right. Well, right. So the crime bill passed in 1994. So that's when when Democrats had Congress. It did have several $1 billion for grants to the states to construct new prisons, and also to have this so-called 3 strikes and you're out, very draconian kind of law, which ended up putting lots of people in prison for a long time, really on drug deals. It also had those were the major provisions, but there were some sort of liberal elements to it. For example, a ban on assault rifles, for 10 years, and also there were some social welfare things like midnight basketball, and then also a violence against women part.
Right,
There had been a separate law that was put together, and so, but one of the motivating things for this was. And here's where the sort of pure, almost ideology takes over. Beginning with the kind of blackouts in the late 70s and sort of the kind of chaos in places like New York during that, and then the rise. Crack cocaine did produce a lot of urban violence. It's true, absolutely true. There was developed a kind of theories of criminality by these sort of neoconservative ideologues. John Delenio was one of them, and James Wilson was another. They were sociologists, and they became quite influential. And the phrase, what's it called, juvenile predators? That phrase, which Hillary Clinton would use, I was able to trace where that came from a kind of academic kind of publication through the National Review, that's the conservative, and then into the White House, and you could Hillary Clinton picked it up and would use that phrase in the 1990s. But it is also true that this fear of crime, whether real or imagined, and to some extent is imagined, was something the Democrats, and here the DLC was influential, thought, oh, we have to, kind of protect ourselves, inure ourselves against Republican critique. And so you have Joe Biden in the midst of this debate saying, the Democrats are the ones who are proposing 100,000 new jail cells, for criminals. The Democrats are the ones who want to get tough. I mean, making that clear, So, and you have people like, for example, socialist
Bernie Sanders.
Bernie Sanders votes in favor of the bill. I mean, he says, I don't like the prison part of it, but I'm all in favor of the assault weapons ban and the violence against women section of it. So I'm voting for it. He did, and 2/3 of the Black Caucus voted in favor of it. Now, at the time, theories of the carceral state were not prevalent. And it was not that controversial at that time. More controversial would be the reform of welfare, which take place 2 years later. That was a bill that generated resignations and protests from the Clinton administration, but not the crime bill. It will be later, when Hillary Clinton begins to run for president, and in the 21st century, that the idea that the crime bill, and it was, contributed to the the carceral state, to the racially discriminatory imprisonment of African Americans and Latinos, and it did.
Yeah.
And that's when it would become a kind of major issue. And it was also, that was the period also when Bill Clinton, and I think Hillary too, and others would say, well, it was a mistake. We shouldn't have done it, et cetera. But at the time, and this is, again, historians have to parse out, where do politicians have real kind of free will, as it were,
Yeah.
and where are they being swept along by kind of ideological social currents that they just sort of accept as necessary. Now, can I say one more thing? Bill, Clinton, again, it just shows going into the 92 campaign, and even before that, and then afterwards, Clinton announces to everyone who will listen, my favorite sociologist is William Julius Wilson, the African-American sociologist from Chicago, whose argument was that to eliminate crime, to strengthen the Black family, we need a massive program of jobs, in the central city. We don't need lectures or prison cells, lectures on morality or prison cells. What we need is massive jobs. And Clinton goes all over the place and to every audience saying, he's the guy, yes. And Wilson's invited to the White House, and that's what Clinton wanted. Now, he doesn't get it. He doesn't get it at all. But that's where his mind was, or at least for a while. And eventually, William Julius Wilson would say, I'm very disappointed in Clinton. I thought he was taking my ideas, but actually in the sort of meat grinder of legislation, many of my key ideas were abandoned, and only the harshest were kept in the bill.
Yeah. So it's interesting. This whole presentism kind of thing always kind of is a wrestling point of sorts. I don't know how I feel about it, but it's interesting though. So one of the last points here I want to bring up, I guess, from the book is this kind of back to economics. I think Summers has been called the Kissinger of economics, fairly or unfairly, and you talk about the importance of Stiglitz opposing Rubin and Summers' approach.
Yeah.
So you could talk about that generally, but this space where Clinton repeals Glass-Steagall, and we all know what happened, right? You know what happened in 2007 and 2008 with the crash and everything. So I guess just talk about, I guess, more second term, I guess, Clinton now, economically with Summers, why they voted to repeal why Clinton repealed Glass-Steagall, and we see the impact that had, a couple years later.
Yeah. I mean, the second term is much more. He's more conservative. The liberals sort of leave. A lot of them do, and Clinton is stuck with Robert Rubin. And then when the Monica Lewinsky scandal comes along, really Clinton, his moral authority and really his authority is diminished considerably, and so people like Rubin are more influential. Now, Glass-Steagall, which was the separation of commercial banking from investment banking. Investment banking is the higher risk kind of banking in which banks are floating bonds and in various kinds of investments, including derivatives and whatnot. Commercial banking is just sort of giving loans, not just to homeowners but also to companies. Anyway, it's a more staid. Anyway, so that had been those two kinds of banking had been divided in the Great Depression by Carter Glass and Steagall. I forget who Steagall's first name is. Anyway, and that was the Glass-Steagall. They'd been divided, and it had the effect of making banking much more boring, so-called, and the kind of speculation more difficult. The Federal Reserve was actually in charge of enforcing Glass-Steagall, and over the years, before Clinton came in and during Clinton, the Federal Reserve under Alan Greenspan, who came in the late 80s, the Federal Reserve itself began to weaken this distinction. And they would say, well, investment banks can purchase, 25% of commercial banks, or vice versa, or let commercial banks, they can also do what investment banks do to a degree. So over the years, this Glass-Steagall was being eroded in any event. It was. But by 1998 and 99, the Treasury Department was, said, well, look, the distinction is not there anymore. Besides, where economic efficiency means we don't want to have these artificial Depression era constraints on what banks can do. Our competitors abroad are doing it anyway. So let's abolish, repeal Glass-Steagall. And they do in, I think it's 98 or 99. Now, actually, and here the liberals like Stieglitz and Alan Blinder would say the repeal of Glass-Steagall did not produce the 2008-2009 crash. That because it was, if it hadn't been repealed, there were plenty of investment banks that had trillions of these derivatives, toxic derivatives around. What more important than the repeal of Glass-Steagall was the complete Wild West world of derivatives, which the Clinton administration also opened the door to. There was an internal debate. About it. Some people, a woman named Boxley Bourne, who was head of the Commodity Future Trading Corporation, which was in theory in charge of derivatives, was very much against allowing them, willy-nilly to be just anyone could issue them, and there would be no guidelines. But she lost, and she was tossed out of the government, and it was the Summers and Robert Rubens and others who won that, and you got this explosive growth of these so-called derivatives, which are very speculative and really are enormous leverage, which means that when something goes wrong, everything goes wrong. And that we can already see that in the late 90s with the collapse of long-term capital, LT, company, a kind of collapse of that this trading company, which the Federal Reserve had to come in and really protect it so that the fever wouldn't spread to all of Wall Street. That we already saw that, and by 2008, 2009, you have just dominoes falling as a result of the collapse of some of these derivatives. And that was probably more important than the repeal of Glass-Steagall. But Glass-Steagall was symbolically important, indicating that, the regulatory strictures of the New Deal, which had produced decades of stability in banking, forget about it. They're over.
Yeah. So when we think about all these issues and or these challenges, and we there's plenty we didn't talk about, obviously, but there's a lot of good stuff in there, of course. And how do we view the legacy of the Clinton administration economically? Again, the book is a fabulous failure. It does sound like there's a lot of failures there. It sounds like there was a lot of acquiescing to certain things. There was a lot of hedging on things. There's a lot, and it wasn't the rebirth of Kennedy as many people thought it was going to be in '92, and it really was a kind of a dud in a lot of ways. So, what's the kind of legacy? Was there anything positive that he did that you did like of sorts? But what's the legacy?
I think the legacy is the understanding that capitalism is not a self-correcting system, and many people of great influence and importance thought that was the case. They also thought it was sort of almost a socially and politically beneficial. That is, one of the arguments for opening trade with China and other countries was this will produce a civil society in these countries, which leading to a kind of at least bourgeois rights for many citizens. I mean, the argument would be, look, if you're going to have a stock exchange in Shanghai, which is then you have to have accurate, economic data, and then that means you have to have newspapers or whatever, which will, are unfettered and produce the truth rather than government propaganda. That was part of the argument. And so people like Gene Sperling, who's currently in the Biden administration, and others were making the point. Look, free trade is not just going to benefit American industry and workers. It's going to democratize China. They were very fervent. They made that point very strongly, and that clearly is a mistake. But I think that the main thing is that capitalism is not a self-correcting system, and therefore Joe Biden and the current administration clearly learned a lot from the Clinton people, and many of them had served in the Obama administration. And so we do have an industrial policy far more ambitious and many times more much money than was even imagined by Clinton liberals in 1992. I think, and then also a trade union movement, which is robust, at least at beginning to be. And I think with this recent UAW strike, which was what was it all about? It was about, are we going to have high wage jobs in the new industry of the future, that is electric vehicles? And it seems to be we're on the track for that. The government supported the workers, and the workers' program was really to sustain the industrial policy of the Biden administration. So I think that I don't know whether they're sitting around saying, "Oh, well, under Clinton we did it wrong," but I think the knowledge of that, the understanding that the market itself is imperfect, I think that's very clear. That's one of the lessons that we've learned, and real policymakers, not just academics, often, in having conferences. So I think that's very important.
That's great.
Awesome.
The book is called A Fabulous Failure, The Clinton Presidency and the Transformation of American Capitalism. This is out through Princeton University Press. Everyone can go and pick that up. Nelson, this was too much fun. I had so much fun talking to you about all of these things. You've scratched that political itch that I get often. So I really appreciate you coming on here and giving us your time and your wisdom. So big thanks.
Delighted to be here. Thank you.